Do you know what the weakest part of an airplane is? Do you think maybe the wing or the tail? About 80% of accidents are the result of some shortcoming on the part of the pilot. So arguably, you and I are the weakest part of the airplane. And that's why we should all be interested in human factors. Over the weekend, I came across the final report for the crash of Yeti Airlines Flight 691, which crashed in Nepal in 2023. And I was struck by how human factors were totally responsible for the accident. And one of those human factors, high pilot workload, can occur in any GA aircraft that you or I might fly. Today we'll talk about that accident and about how you can mitigate a high pilot workload. And I hope you'll share this show with others and post comments about how you deal with high workloads. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is just to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 336, we talked with Jim Simon about his engine failure near Seattle and what it was like pulling the CAPS parachute. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/336. And if you're new to this show, welcome. I'm glad you found us. Now, we want you to stick around. So to do that, take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Spotify or Apple podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you, this is a listener-supported show, and we have several ways that you can show your love and support for the show. So if you would take a moment right now, go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via Patreon, Zelle, PayPal, and Venmo. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Today, I'm going to talk first about the accident, and then I'll talk about high workload as a human factor and how to mitigate it. And finally, I'll tell you a little about the experience of the pilots who were flying the plane. And as I talk about the accident, think about the pilots and about what you suppose their experience levels were. On January 15th, 2023, an ATR-72 was operating a scheduled flight between Kathmandu, that's VNKT, and Pokhara International, which is VNPR. The same flight crew operated two legs between those two airports earlier in the morning. For the first leg, the aircraft landed on runway 30 at VNPR and later departed from there using runway 12. The accident occurred during a visual approach to runway 12 at VNPR. The takeoff, climb, and cruise and descent were normal. The weather was compatible with VMC. During the first contact with the tower controller assigned runway 30 for the aircraft to land. But during the later phases of flight, the flight crew, without mentioning any reason for changing runways, requested and received clearance to change to runway 12. At 10:51 a.m., the aircraft descended from 6,500 feet at about 15 miles away and joined the downwind leg for runway 12 to the north of the airport. The aircraft was visually identified by ATC. At 10:56, the pilots extended the flaps to the 15-degree position, and 46 seconds later, they selected the landing gear lever to the down position. At 10:56:27, the PF, or pilot flying, disengaged the autopilot system at an altitude of 721 feet above the ground. The PF then called for flaps 30, and the PM, the pilot monitoring, replied, flaps 30. The Flight Data Recorder, or FDR, did not record any flap surface movement at that time. Instead, the propeller rotation speed, NP, of both engines decreased simultaneously to less than 25%, and the torque, or TQ, started decreasing to 0%, consistent with both propellers going into the feathered condition. The feathered condition is not recorded in the FDR. On the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, the area microphone recording, a single master caution chime was recorded. As per the CVR readout, the flight crew then carried out the before landing checklist without identifying that the flaps were not in the 30-degree position before starting the left turn onto the base leg. During that time, the power lever angle increased from 41% to 44%. At that point, the NP of both propellers was recorded as non-computed data in the FDR, and the TQ of both engines was at 0%. When propellers are in feather, they are not producing thrust. When both propellers were feathered, both engines were running in flight idle condition during the event flight as per design to prevent over-torque. As per the FDR data, the engine turbo machines were functioning as expected, considering the propellers were feathered. At about 10:57, when the radio altitude call-out for 500 feet was enunciated, another click sound was heard. The aircraft turned to the left and reached a maximum bank angle of 30 degrees. The recorded NP and TQ data remained non-computed, in line with propellers being in feather condition. The yaw dampers were disconnected 4 seconds later. The PF consulted the PM on whether to continue the left turn, and the PM replied to continue. Subsequently, the PF asked the PM about whether to continue to descend, and the PM responded it was not necessary and instructed to apply a little power. Another click was heard, followed by the flaps moving to the 30-degree position. When ATC gave the clearance for landing at 10:57, the crew did not respond. The PF mentioned twice that there was no power coming from the engines. The FDR data shows that at 10:57, the power levers were advanced first to 62 degrees, then to the maximum power position in 2 seconds. 1 second after a click sound, the aircraft was at the initiation of its left turn at 368 feet AGL. The high-pressure turbine speed of both engines increased from 73 to 77%. It's noted that at 10:57:18, in the very last stage of the flight, the PF handed over control of the aircraft to the PM. 2 seconds later, the PM, who was previously the PF, repeated again that there was no power from the engines. 4 seconds later, when the aircraft was at 311 feet AGL, the stick shakers were activated, warning the crew that the aircraft angle of attack increased up to the stick shaker threshold. 2 seconds later, a second sequence of stick shaker warnings was activated when the aircraft banked toward the left abruptly. 3 seconds later, the radio altitude alert for 200 feet was enunciated, and the cricket sound and stick shaker ceased. The sound of impact was then heard in the CVR. All 68 passengers and 4 crew members were killed. Now let's go to the human factors analysis portion of the report. The Investigation Commission was assisted by the services of a group of experts in the field of human factors from the FAA to analyze human factor issues in the accident. The Shell model was used for the analysis. In aviation, the Shell model is one of many methods that may be used to understand the relationship between the human and the environment with respect to an incident or accident, and to analyze the interaction of multiple systems. In the Shell model, S stands for software, H for hardware, E for environment, L for liveware, and L for central liveware or people. Under the liveware section, it says a 72-hour history of both crew members indicated that fatigue and health issues were not a factor prior to the accident. Both pilots were reported to have eaten routine foods, went to bed, and rose at routine hours. The PF owned a noise-canceling headset, and this type of device has been known to decrease the sensitivity of acoustical sensory cues in flight and may have contributed to the crew not perceiving the accidental feathering of both engines. The PM did not own a noise-canceling headset. The CVR transcript captured a flight deck environment rich with discussion on the appropriate way to fly a visual approach into the new Pokhara airport. Both pilots were experiencing high workload and distractions to the external environment, which may have impacted effective CRM in the cockpit. This may have led them to not follow the checklist properly in critical phases of flight. The crew were most probably distracted due to excessive conversation in the cockpit because the flight was the first for the PF and the PM was occupied with providing instructions and was not focusing on the PM duties. Under environment, it says, although weather conditions and time of day were optimal, challenges provided by the opening of the new Pokhara airport certainly played a role in crew distraction. The new airport had opened only 2 weeks prior to the accident. The crew requested to land on runway 12, necessitating flying a downwind base and final leg instead of a straight-in approach that they were initially cleared for. This may have been part of the instructor pilot's decision to ensure proficiency at approaching the airport from both directions. Maneuvering and configuring the aircraft for a visual approach to a new airport could have certainly increased the workload and stress on both crew members. A visual approach requires attention outside of the aircraft by the PF and adequate support from the PM to ensure all checklist items in aircraft configuration settings are done correctly. In this case, it's likely that both crew members were focused outside the aircraft, which could result in distractions in carrying out the PM functions. And under hardware, it says the center pedestal design of the ATR-72 does not directly preclude inadvertent movement of the propeller condition levers in lieu of the flap handle or vice versa, but some design considerations mitigate this risk. To move a propeller conditional lever, the pilot must first activate a trigger below the lever to disengage the lever from a detent. Similarly, the flap handle also has detents, but there is no trigger. The entire flap handle is raised to lift the lever out of the detent. Additionally, the shape of each lever is such that they would feel different when touched. There are a number of different levers, 2 for condition levers and 1 for flaps. The colors are different, and their locations on the pedestal also differ. The flap handle is shaped like an airfoil. The propeller condition levers have ridged knobs. The thrust levers are smooth and cylindrical. And the landing gear handle is shaped like a wheel. These are all industry standard design considerations. Consideration has been given by the investigation to the alignment of flap handles in the 15-degree position, which is geometrically close to the condition lever auto position. Given the previous design features, therefore, one must consider other inputs such as workload, conformation bias, and the operational context that contributed to the pilot monitoring actions. The CVR transcript also highlighted that the crew was making configuration changes prior to landing well below 1,000 feet AGL, which could contribute to increasing the crew workload. And then under visual approach procedure, it says, at the time of the accident, Pokhara had 2 operational airports, Pokhara Airport and Pokhara International, which is VNPR. Pokhara Airport was used for domestic flights, whereas VNPR was used for international flights. VNPR was newly opened on January 1st, 2023. At the time of the accident, there were no published instrument procedures, and it was operating as a VFR-only airport. However, procedures to allow for such visual approaches had not been developed. The operator had developed a visual traffic pattern internally into VNPR, which attempted for the aircraft to remain clear of surrounding terrain and the Pokhara domestic airport. This resulted in an approach that required tight turns during the descent and would result in the aircraft being at a lower altitude once aligned to runway 12. This did not meet the requirements for a stabilized visual approach. This result was a challenging approach, increasing the flight crew's workload and decreasing safety margins. The operator had carried out demonstration flights to VNPR prior to its opening. However, the demonstration flights were for VFR landings on runway 30 and departure from runway 12. The operator had also developed a visual circuit for landing on runway 12, but did not carry out any demonstration flights for that visual approach. Probable cause: the inadvertent movement of both condition levers to the feathered position in flight, which resulted in feathering of both propellers and subsequent loss of thrust, leading to an aerodynamic stall and collision with terrain. Contributing factors were 1, high workload due to operating into a new airport with surrounding terrain, and the crew missing the associated flight deck and engine indications that both props had been feathered. 2, human factor issues such as high workload and stress that appears to have resulted in the misidentification and selection of the propellers to the feathered position. 3, the proximity of terrain requiring a tight circuit to land on runway 12. That tight pattern was not the usual visual pattern and contributed to the high workload. This tight pattern also meant that the approach did not meet the stabilized visual approach criteria. 4, use of visual approach circuits for runway 12 without any evaluation, validation, and resolution of its threats. 5, lack of appropriate technical and skill-based training, including simulator, to the crew and proper classroom briefings for that flight, for the safe operation of flight at the new airport for a visual approach to runway 12. And finally, 6, non-compliance with SOPs, ineffective CRM, and lack of sterile cockpit discipline. And all of that comes from the final report. We'll have a link to it in our show notes. In a moment, I'll talk about human factors, but first let me mention some of your good news. First, congratulations to Patreon mega supporter Jim Goldfuss. He writes he just passed his PC-12 Part 135 SIC check ride. He's a CFII at Republic Airport on Long Island, and he's now a pilot flying the PC-12NG for PlaneSense. And also congratulations to Patreon supporter Erica Duberman. He wrote, passed my helicopter check ride last week at the age of 65. Took me 84 hours of instruction as an add-on, but the feeling of accomplishment is worth every penny. Well, congratulations, Eric. And yes, I did that last year at age 66, and it was very satisfying. And if you're interested in adding on a helicopter rating, I encourage you to check out episode 283, Wings to Rotors, How You Can Start Now to Add a Helicopter Rating, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/283. And if you've been listening to the show for a while and are finding value from the show, I'd like to invite you to join our community by supporting the show. Now, I know there are other things in your life that you support because you believe in them and you find value in them, but how many of those other things could save your life? Well, that's what we try to do here. Provide you with useful tools that may someday save your life. So if that's something you believe in, please add Aviation News Talk to the things that you support. And it's so easy to do. It'll only take you a couple of minutes. So stop what you're doing and do it now. Just going out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And there you'll see 4 options for supporting the show financially. And when you do sign up to support the show, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so very much. Now, since aviation is a small community, see if you know any of these people who've signed up in the last few days to support the show. And first, we have a new mega supporter. These are the folks that donate $50 a month, and after 2 months, I send them a signed copy of one of my books. Thanks so much to Michael Baraz, president of the Chicago Executive Flyers Association, and a relatively new CFI/II. And we have 2 people who are new to Patreon. Thanks so much to Michael Smith and John Griffin. Thanks so very much for your support. And now let's talk about human factors. Some of the following comes from the Flight Crew Human Factors Handbook, published by the UK's CAA, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes. It says that workload can be loosely and simply thought of as the amount of mental effort needed to process information. In general, high workload is associated with increased errors, fatigue, task degradation, and poor performance. Attention and working memory are keys to understanding workload. The more attention is required and used, the higher the workload is said to be. Skilled tasks require attention to learn, but once learned, use very little or no attention. This is the brain's main strategy of workload reduction, to turn repeated tasks into skilled routines so they can be performed in the future without demanding attention and therefore generating workload. Without this strategy and capability, everyday life tasks would be impossible. And it talks about some of the causes of high workload. It says that there are 4 general task factors, including 1, difficulty of the task, 2, number of tasks running in parallel, 3, number of tasks in a series, so you're switching from task to task, and 4, the time available for the task or the speed of the task. Now, let me just add a couple of my thoughts here. Often there's not a lot we can do about the difficulty of the task. Some of the things you might do is you can get others to help so you can offload some of those tasks. Or in some cases, we can try to pull items or tasks that might normally happen near the end of the flight further forward into the flight to reduce the workload at the end. A great example of that is getting the ATIS as early as possible. I often see pilots forget to do this until the last moment when they should be doing other things, such as contacting the tower. Now back to the handbook. We're going to focus on time available for task or speed of task. Attempting to process a task more rapidly than one would prefer adds difficulty to the task and potentially induces error. Additionally, the very awareness of reduced time can itself add an extra attentional demand as the pilot starts to worry and fret about the lack of time available to do what's needed, which of course just adds to the workload. And yet, the time available for a task is probably the one area over which we have the greatest control when we're flying. Again, some of my thoughts here. Many pilots are type A and figure, hey, I've got a fast airplane. I want to use it to get to my destination as quickly as possible. And yet, sometimes slow is fast. In other words, if we go more slowly on a task, we're more likely to complete it correctly, which saves time from the rework that we'll have to do if we don't get it right the first time. So just remember, slow is fast. And that just underscores the importance of taking time to do things carefully and methodically rather than rushing and missing important details. Now, I have 2 strategies for increasing the time available to complete tasks when I'm experiencing heavy workload. One is that I start working on my planning for my descent and approach into an airport earlier than some pilots do. You've probably experienced this. You're enjoying the light workload that you have in cruise, you're talking away, enjoying the view, but then you pay for it later with a heavy workload. Here's what I do when I'm in the Vision Jet. When the flight plan shows we have an hour to go to our destination, that's when I start working with pilots to make sure we have thoroughly reviewed everything we'll need to do for the rest of the flight. Now, that can involve reviewing the arrival procedure. We'll be looking for any speed limitations and whether it's a descend via type arrival in which we'll be cleared to follow the step downs on our own. We'll also be working to figure out which runway we'll be likely to land on and start reviewing instrument approaches to that runway. And while we may be too far out to hear the ATIS, we might look at Sirius XM weather to see what runway the winds favor or even the D-ATIS. By contrast, if you're flying a VFR flight at lower altitudes, you might reasonably choose a shorter time to use as a trigger for when to start preparing for landing. So starting to prepare earlier is a way to increase the time available for tasks. The other strategy I use is to increase the time available by either slowing down and or increasing the length of the flight path. Now, I refer to the throttle or thrust lever as a time machine. You just pull it back and it creates more time. And you can also increase the distance flown, which creates more time, and you can do that in several ways. If you're not ready to begin an instrument approach, ask for delay vectors. ATC will then point you in a safe direction until you let them know that you are set up to begin the approach. Or in the traffic pattern, you could extend your downwind and turn base later than usual, though you do need to keep other pilots apprised of what you're planning to do. So if you're at a towered airport, apprise ATC. At a non-towered airport, announce your intentions to fly a longer pattern. Now let's talk about some of the effects of high workload. From a practical perspective, increasing workload has the following symptoms: attentional and task focusing, task shedding and reprioritization, increased use of decision shortcuts and less scrutiny or review, increased fatigue and chance of error. Sustained workload contributes to fatigue. Very high workload, particularly fast onset, and feelings of not coping with the workload can cause high arousal or stress. All these things make errors more likely. A direct effect that occurs with high workload is the focusing of attention, also called attentional narrowing, coning, or funneling. Attentional focusing is a very effective strategy that appears to have evolved in order to maximize concentration on a problem or threat. Additionally, because your attention is narrowly focused, other events and stimuli that would normally draw your attention fail to do so. Hence, information outside the task can be missed. Now, while this can be a positive effect since it minimizes distraction, it can lead to important signals being missed, even signals that are seemingly highly salient, in other words, loud or bright. There are many repeated stories of pilots landing despite continual loud alerts sounding all the way down the approach because the gear was up. Under a high workload task, a pilot might not have the capability to search and assess other areas, problems, and alternatives. This is one reason for the insidious nature of an apparent bias that leads pilots to stick to courses of action that, in hindsight, appear to be flawed. In order to do something other than continue a mentally planned action, such as continuing an approach, attention will have to be diverted from the primary task in order to make other assessments. As well as the reluctance to remove attention, this would also represent a switch of attention that has a cost of itself. When all attention is focused on one element of the operation, such as an emergency, then situational awareness of other aspects in the wider picture will suffer as a consequence. The process of maintaining high awareness requires attention and hence workload, and it follows that situational awareness around the area of focus can be high even when overall situation awareness might decrease. Maintaining situational awareness requires attention, and situational awareness is therefore as likely to be lost under very low workload as it is under high workload. Hence, the relationship between high workload and situational awareness is far from simple. If the cause of excessive workload is several concurrent or serial tasks, then the unconscious urge is to shed one or several tasks into continual switching tasks. If some of those tasks are autonomous, then the skill may continue unchecked. In the case of executive control tasks, those are kind of the high-level thinking tasks, one or more tasks might effectively be dropped, but this will not always be noticed due to the concentration on other tasks. Unfortunately, there is no general rule to predict which task may suffer and which will be prioritized. Situations and combinations of tasks are extremely varied, and so it will depend on many factors. In a given example here, it says, a poorly planned glider flight under a low cloud base developed into a very low-level traffic pattern. With the increasing workload and considerable anxiety, I became fixated on the landing area. The low height and strong tailwind exacerbated the sense of speed to such an extent that I ceased to monitor the airspeed indicator. I was very lucky to survive the stall and spin accident that destroyed the glider. And it says in the above anecdote, the pilot's attention has narrowed to the critical area of concern, the landing area. The pilot was unsure whether he could make the pattern work. Under high workload, the scan of the airspeed indicator was dropped because powerful but unreliable speed cues were available from the peripheral texture flow that falsely reassured him of the airspeed. The workload and anxiety were strong enough to overcome all the pilot's experience and training in this respect. Now, this story about the glider pilot forgetting to watch airspeed, stalling, and then crashing made me think of the Cessna 421 twin crash that we talked about 2 weeks ago in episode 335. In that case, the aircraft diverted to Steamboat Springs, Colorado for reasons that we still don't know, though it didn't appear to be an engine issue as the pilot loitered near the airport for about 20 minutes before making a rapid descent to line up with runway 14. But apparently the pilot realized that he was too high and fast as he turned about 30 degrees to join a rough approximation of a downwind leg. But when he turned base, he apparently got too slow and, according to witnesses, entered a spin. Now, I can't help but wonder if making a diversion and then making a last-minute decision to change runways led to a high workload and that the pilot failed to monitor his airspeed on base. And my takeaway is that whenever we're in a high workload situation, we've just got to force ourselves to remember that airspeed is life. And we have to remember above all else to check our airspeed frequently while in the traffic pattern. And another thing I've noticed is that often when people turn base, they go from a nose-low attitude to an aircraft level attitude, probably because they've added flaps. And that's when the aircraft will start to slow down. So you got to check and make sure that that aircraft attitude remains down throughout the approach to landing. Getting back to the handbook, it says, when assessing information and making decisions, high workload can lead to complex decisions being taken more rapidly than normal, possibly without considering some factors, options, or complexities. Whether a decision is itself the creator of high workload or whether it must happen alongside a different high workload task, similar issues apply. The temptation can be to base that decision on just a few criteria rather than considering how factors interact. A temptation will be to get the decision made and shed that decision task, lowering workload and returning to the primary task of operating the aircraft. An increased chance of error comes from all the above factors. High workloads on a particular task makes errors on other tasks more likely to happen and less likely to be noticed, particularly autonomous routines or checking tasks that have been under-prioritized. There can be benefits from high workload. Task engagement and concentration on a single task are some. And relating that to the Yeti crash that we talked about, the captain was highly experienced. Some of his routines may have become autonomous and hence didn't get the kind of attention that they should have had. Now, the next section is application of knowledge related to workloads, and it says, processes that primarily require executive control will add considerably to workload. These might include concentrating, paying attention, calculating, trying to remember something, being careful, maintaining awareness, doing an unfamiliar or novel task, doing a new or unlearned task, doing a challenging task, making a decision, assessing evidence, reviewing a situation, looking for something, listening to something or someone, managing a set of tasks, etc. Although most of these things happen regularly on a flight deck, excessive workload is not usually caused. But when they are required to be managed in addition to existing tasks, or are particularly challenging or time-limited, there is a danger of excessive workload and problems associated with it. Lowering of workload can be discussed in the light of 4 workload drivers discussed earlier. Task difficulty is the driver that is least likely to be able to be reduced at the time. There is often no quick way to make a task less difficult. However, time limitation or speed of task is the most obvious variable that a pilot can change to affect workload. When possible, allowing more time for a task lowers the workload and helps to avoid a vicious cycle of workload from building up. And they give the example here, a captain on a line check needed to return to land after a technical snag, meaning they could not dispatch for the next sector. After the decision had been made, he said to the FO, "Let's not hurry, keep flying away from the airfield while we make a plan and set up the FMS. That way we will have time to fly a normal descent and approach. Parallel tasks, usually requiring effective CRM practices, relieving a colleague of one task for a short time or asking a colleague to take over a task, can bring back sufficient capacity for normal functioning. With serial tasks, the issue is not the task themselves, but the switching. The brain naturally tries to avoid continual attention switches that are costly and difficult, but when two non-shareable tasks must be completed, the strategy used for parallel tasks applies. In other words, CRM and rearranging flight deck tasks. Unfortunately, there are situations that occur in the flight deck that have aspects of all the four workload drivers, particularly emergency situations. In such cases, if time can be created, it lowers the workload as well as facilitating better management of tasks between crew members. Dealing with high workload is problematic for an individual once they are in a high workload situation. This is not because people do not recognize high workload. Individuals are good at self-reporting their workload. However, several other effects mean that high workloads may not be recognized for what it is at the time. First, the perception of the time changes so that it feels like less time has passed. Hence, the higher speeds of task is less obvious. Secondly, high workload tasks are so absorbing that the individual may not consider the workload that they are under. In effect, they do not have the time and capacity to step outside the situation briefly to consider their own effectiveness or ineffectiveness. Because of these issues, relying on individuals to recognize and then manage their own workloads can be unreliable unless specific training or practice is given. More realistic triggers for initiating workload management are recognition of the changing situation before the workload elevates, recognition of high workload in a different crew member, or recognition of the task characteristics and types of situations rather than recognizing the effects of them. And here's another example. A new captain experienced his first emergency and was returning to the airfield, having had an engine shut down a few minutes into the flight. While the emergency checklists were being completed, ATC turned the aircraft downwind while the crew prepared for the approach. On being given a closing heading, even though everything was done, the captain recognized he was not feeling comfortable and felt rushed. He instructed the FO to tell ATC to extend downwind for another minute, extended the flaps, and took a moment to review prior to turning in. And here's a general summary of the typical human responses that can occur under high workload conditions. 1. Decreased situational awareness. Individuals may lose track of the overall situation as they become more focused on specific tasks, potentially missing important cues or changes in the environment. 2. Reduced attention span. There may be a narrowing of attention where people concentrate on a limited number of tasks or details, neglecting others. 3. Slower reaction times. The ability to respond quickly to new information or changes can be impaired. 4. Increased errors. The likelihood of making mistakes increases due to cognitive overload and fatigue. 5. Auditory exclusion or auditory tunneling. This occurs when the brain is so focused on a specific task or set of tasks that it filters out other sensory inputs, including sounds, to concentrate on the primary activity at hand. Individuals may fail to hear alarms or other auditory signals because their focus is directed elsewhere. This can be particularly dangerous as pilots may miss critical alarms or warnings. 6. Tunnel vision. Vision may become restricted to a narrow field, leading to missing peripheral clues. 7. Physical stress responses. Increased heart rate, sweating, and other signs of physical stress can occur. 8. Impaired decision-making. High stress and workload can lead to poor decision-making, where individuals might rely on more automatic, less optimal responses. 9. Communication breakdown. Under stress, individuals may communicate less effectively, which can lead to misunderstandings or missed information. And finally, 10. Task shedding. People might start ignoring or abandoning tasks they perceive as less critical to focus on those they deem more immediately. So, understanding these typical responses to high workload conditions is crucial so that you and I can develop our own strategies to help mitigate the risk associated with high workload. Now, one of the key things I took away from the Human Factors course I took at USC a few months ago is that no matter how good a pilot we are, or that we like to think we are, we're all human and hence fallible, and you and I will make mistakes when we fly. So we have to develop strategies for catching those mistakes and trapping those errors. Now, in a moment, we'll talk about the experience of the pilots on Yeti Airlines Flight 691. But first, let me mention that there's another easy way that you can support the show, which is that you can support the show when you buy a Lightspeed headset. Now, I've been using only Lightspeed headsets for over 25 years. I currently have 4 of their different models, which I use in different airplanes and helicopters. 2 of my favorite things about Lightspeed are their trade-up program and their support. The trade-up program lets you trade in an older Lightspeed headset for a new model, and they'll give you hundreds of dollars of credit for your old headset. I've used that program at least 3 or 4 times over the years to trade up to newer models, and I love it because it preserves my investment that I made in the original headset. And their support is great. They've never charged me a penny for fixing any of my headsets, and their turnaround time is relatively short, which is important to me, as I often fly 5 days a week. When you buy a new headset from Lightspeed, they will send a donation to the show, but only if you use one of the links in our show notes first to get to their website. To find those links, just go out on the web and type in aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. By the way, my favorite model is the Lightspeed Delta Zulu because I have some hearing loss, and the Delta Zulu has a built-in frequency equalizer that you can custom tune to your ears to compensate for any hearing loss. It took me only just a few minutes to set that up, and I find that it makes it a little easier for me to understand ATC transmissions. Again, check out all of their models by going to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. Thanks so much. Now let's talk about the experience of the pilots on Yeti Airlines Flight 691. What did you guess their experience levels might be? Well, here's what the final report says about this crew. This was the 3rd flight by the crew members on that day. As per the CVR recordings, it was understood that the flight was operated by 2 captains. One captain was in the process of obtaining aerodrome familiarization for operating into VNPR, and the other captain was an instructor pilot. The captain being familiarized, who was occupying the left seat, was the pilot flying, and the instructor pilot, who was occupying the right-hand seat, was the pilot monitoring. The pilot flying was 44 years old and had a total of 6,396 hours, including 186 hours in the ATR. The pilot monitoring, the Czech captain, was 58 years old and had a total of 21,901 hours, including 3,300 hours in the ATR. And the report says that the challenges provided by the opening of the new Pokhara airport certainly played a role in crew distraction. The new airport had opened only 2 weeks prior to the accident flight, and both crew members had extensive flying experience in Nepal and experience flying to and from the old Pokhara airport. Because the old Pokhara airport was very close to the new Pokhara airport, it can be assumed that both pilots were very familiar with the terrain around Pokhara. So arguably the crew was very experienced. But nonetheless, that didn't stop the Czech captain from accidentally operating the condition levers instead of the flaps. One thing the report didn't address was that since the Czech captain was sitting in the right seat, the flaps were now the closest controls, not the farthest as they were when he had been sitting in the left seat, which is the seat you'd expect a captain to have spent most of their recent flying time. And while traditionally we tend to think of having more experience as being beneficial, I wonder whether having lots of experience can sometimes lead to overconfidence and complacency. Could it be that the Czech captain spent so much time flying ATRs that the task became repetitive and that now he did some things automatically without really thinking about what he was doing? Overconfidence and complacency. Those are 2 key factors that can erode some of the safety benefits that we normally would gain from having lots of flying experience. And by the way, complacency is one of the so-called dirty dozen. No, not the movie. The dirty dozen refers to 12 of the most common human error preconditions or conditions that can act as precursors to accidents or incidents. These 12 elements can influence people to make mistakes, and we'll talk more about them in future shows. By the way, this accident bears some similarity to TransAsia Airways Flight 235, which crashed in Taiwan in 2015. It was also an ATR-72, and its crew also made a mistake in operating the controls. 2 minutes after takeoff, the pilots reported an engine failure. That final report found that following the uncommanded auto feather of engine number 2, the right engine, the pilot flying the aircraft reduced power and subsequently shut down the operating engine number 1, which was the left engine. The flight crew failed to perform the failure identification procedure and did not comply with standard operating procedures. The loss of power from both engines was not detected and corrected by the crew in time, and the aircraft stalled during the attempted restart at an altitude from which they could not recover. So I'm hoping that you found value in our discussion about the human factors associated with high workload, and that it's given you some tools for recognizing and then dealing with high workloads that you might encounter. And one other thought, one of the things that came out of my safety classes is that accidents or incidents are often preceded by some kind of change, which is why if an organization is planning some change to their operation, it may make sense to do a safety review before implementing the change. And as a pilot, look for changes that make a flight different from previous flights, as that change could put a hole in the normal defenses you have in place and potentially lead to an accident. And now let me talk about our mega supporters. And these are the people who do the heavy lifting and provide about a third of all the support for the show. And after 2 months as a mega supporter, they get a signed copy of one of my books. Now to join this honor roll of mega supporters, it's easy. Just sign up on Patreon at aviationnewstalk.com/support. Thanks so much to our 3 top-level supporters. Kevin Hendrickson, who's just bought a share of a Vision Jet. Congratulations. Roy Williams, he's a Vision Jet owner in Southern California who runs ASAP Home Health that provides in-home nursing services in California and also trains family members to become nurses. And Mike Mendeborough from Palm City, Florida. And then our next tier includes these 5 people. Thanks to Dylan Caldwell, who I visited with recently. He's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida. And teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. So if you need a basic med, first, second, or third class flight physical, you can contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. And thanks to Jonathan Weisswasser, he's a vascular surgeon. He's built an RV-8 and now flies a Cessna Mustang. He writes that he's a TCI instructor at P6 Aviation, a school teaching almost exclusively in Cirrus aircraft based in Caldwell, New Jersey. And you can check his YouTube channel, Life in the FL, which chronicles his flying a Meridian for Eagle Mania, which is a National Eagles tribute band for which he's a drummer. And Derek Doyle, he's an Irish-based ATP who flies helicopters and gyroplanes, and he's a CFI and pilot examiner. Frank Steves, and Dane Jasper, who flies a TBM out of Santa Rosa. And now for our mega supporters, those folks who are at the $50 a month level, thanks so much to Victor Vogel. He lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, he says he's happily retired in Eagle, Idaho, and flies a Turbo SR-22 out of Napa. Stephen Elop flies a Cessna T-182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Kent Mazzia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Seth Lake, you know him. He's an airline pilot and also a DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. You can find out more about him or schedule a check ride at vsl.aero. Rick Miller, he teaches full-time in the Cincinnati area out of both the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Piper, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They have a pair of Cessna T-240 aircraft and a 2021 Piper M350. Johnny McDade, he's a singer, songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFII at Republic Airport, and now a pilot flying the PC-12NG for PlaneSense. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI who teaches at Advantage Aviation at the Palo Alto Airport and gives tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan, he flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a couple hundred hours of experience in his Vision Jet. William Birch, he donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela, with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, he's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He does a lot of add-on ratings from fixed-wing to helicopter in his R-44, and he gives Bell Series insurance audit training for recurrency and initial training. You can find him at lonestarheli.com. Don Dillman, who I finally met in person recently at a meeting. He's recently retired from running an airline flight department. He's also a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and he's a new Cirrus CSIP instructor. John Tosto, he's an attorney from Flint, Michigan, and a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association and a co-owner of a Cherokee 6. Vic Bajaj. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at KPTK, the Oakland County Airport, north of Detroit. He owns a VTOL Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. Ed Kelly, he flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and said that his son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in the Woodlands, Texas, that you can find at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking of buying a Cirrus. Todd Kussel lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22T. Marlon Dutra works in tech here in the Bay Area and flies an DA-62. Greg Campbell, he's a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, Canada, flying a DA-40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendek, he's a hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies an SR-22G6 based at Republic Airport on Long Island, and he's working on his commercial. Rob Thomas lives near Atlanta, flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and flies a 1977 182 out of Georgetown Airport. Daniel Maddox flies a G36 out of KMKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from iRecover Treatment Centers. John Trowbridge, he's a doc in Humble, Texas, and flies his 4 Air Coupes. Dan Morris, he's a cardiovascular ICU nurse by day and commercial pilot by night, currently working on his CFI with a goal to fly charter, fractional, or medevac. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies a Cessna 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch Bush tires. And he also flies Cirrus aircraft out of Henderson and KSGU, and he's buying a Bonanza. Dan Sweeney, student pilot working on his private in an SR-20 at Mike Goulian Aviation in Bedford, Mass. Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson, they fly out of Morristown and Somerset, New Jersey airports, and they're partners in Business Compliance Services, which specializes in fingerprinting services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. Arturo Guerrera, we've had him on the show. He donates in the memory of his son Arturo Jr., and he owns a software company that created a solution for EAPIS called FlashPass, which is available for the iPhone, Android, and on the web at flashpass.net. Nick Passmore, he's a student pilot training in a Warrior in Vancouver, Australia. Anonymous. Jim Brosfield, he's a doctor in Tennessee. Renato Steinberg, who's founder and CEO of a customizable credit card called Clutch with a K. And Renato said that he'll give listeners who sign up a one-time $20 credit if they use the promo code MAX. Their website is at clutchcard.com. Tyler Watley, who flies a 172 and has a Cirrus. Ron Peterson, who's from Utah. Drew Anderson is a dermatologist who flies a Cherokee 235 out of Anderson, Indiana. He's working on his instrument rating and looking to buy a Cirrus. Hunter Clark from N-Flight Cam. They make GoPro accessories, including aircraft camera mounts and audio cables. You can find them at nflightcam.com. Chris Waters. Kimberly Coons. She's an instrument-rated pilot working on her commercial and multi-engine. Eric Himes. He runs a new nonprofit called Hope on Short Final that does emergency relief supply flights in response to weather disasters. You can find more about them at hopeonshortfinal.org. William Kinney. Miles Tedder, working on the instrument rating and just bought a Cirrus SR-20 G6. Ed Carrolls. Derek Doyle. Philip Dade, who owns a handful of restaurants in Arizona and Utah and splits his time between the two states. Shannon Day, he's completed his private instrument ratings at Scottsdale at the Arizona Cirrus Factory Training Center, and he's building up hours and experience in his SR-22, and he eventually wants to become a jet pilot. And he's a sales leader with IT consulting firm Avanade, that's A-V-A-N-A-D-E, working with some of the largest financial services companies in the West. Scott Sutton, Peter White, David Ford flies SR-20s out of Leesburg, Virginia, and working on his instrument rating. Robert Emery, Aaron Elder, he and his partners have a SF-50 Vision Jet available for rent at Apogee Air at the Oakland International Airport in Oakland County, Michigan. That's KPTK. Tom Higgins, he's a student in an SR-20 at All In Aviation in Henderson, Nevada. Christopher Cole, he's creating videos about getting a position towing gliders and has created 2 videos about towing gliders. You can check them out at his YouTube channel at Freedom Fixer Flying. Pilot Life, they offer a digital logbook. You can find more about them at pilotlife.com. Atticus Tyson, he flies the Cirrus SR-22T out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Andrei Tikhonov, he says he's working on his commercial. Jeff Noiseau, he's a 70-year-old student pilot who's enjoying aviation news talk. Jarrett Davis flies a turboprop and loves all of our show topics. Thank you, Jarrett. Kenneth Solaski, he donates in the memory of his dad, Edward Solaski, who was a mechanic at Grumman. Chris Knotts, he's a partner in a 172 and thinking of buying a faster plane. Paul Tierstein, Brandon Schock, Jules Myers, he's a student pilot out of Aviation Adventures in Leesburg, Virginia. And Michael Baraz, president of the Chicago Executive Flyers Association and a relatively new CFI/II. Thank you all for being on the honor roll and supporting the show. And if you're in the U.S., well, hope you enjoy your 4th of July holiday. I'll be doing what I can to stay cool. And if you have a few spare minutes over the holidays, I'd like you to take some action to help grow the show. Lots of different ways that you can do that. If you haven't done this before, head on out to whatever app that you're listening to us now and leave a 5-star review. Or tell one or more of your friends about the show. And of course, you can also support the show financially by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And if you're in the market for a new headset, please consider buying one of my favorite headsets, the Lightspeed headsets. And if you do that, they'll make a donation to help support the show, but only if you first go out to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed and click on one of those links to get to their website. Thanks so much for your support in whatever way you support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue sign up. And remember, you can always go around.